Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. Today we'll be in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32 through chapter 12, verse 21. In those days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel's territory. Hazael attacked their eastern border. He conquered all the land of Gilead, including the territory of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, extending all the way from the Aroer in the Arnon Valley through Gilead to Bashan. The rest of the events of Jehu's reign, including all his accomplishments and successes, are recorded in the scroll called the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Jehu passed away and was buried in Samaria. His son Jehoahaz replaced him as king. Jehu reigned over Israel for 28 years in Samaria. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she was determined to destroy the entire royal line. So Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram and sister of Ahaziah, took Ahaziah's son Joash and sneaked him away from the rest of the royal descendants who were to be executed. She hid him and his nurse in the room where the bed covers were stored. So he was hidden from Athaliah and escaped execution. He hid out with his nurse in the Lord's temple for 6 years, while Athaliah was ruling over the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada summoned the officers of the units of hundreds of the Carians and the royal bodyguard. He met with them in the Lord's temple. He made an agreement with them and made them swear an oath of allegiance in the Lord's temple. Then he showed them the king's son. He ordered them, "This is what you must do. 1/3 of the unit that is on duty during the Sabbath will guard the royal palace. Another third of you will be stationed at the foundation gate. Still another third of you will be stationed at the gate behind the royal guard. You will be taking turns guarding the palace. The 2 units who are off duty on the Sabbath will guard the Lord's temple and protect the king. You must surround the king. Each of you must hold his weapon in his hand. Whoever approaches your ranks must be killed. You must accompany the king wherever he goes." The officers of the units of hundreds did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each of them took his men, those who were on duty during the Sabbath as well as those who were off duty on the Sabbath, and reported to Jehoiada the priest. The priest gave to the officers of the units of hundreds King David's spears and the shields that were kept in the Lord's temple. The royal bodyguard took their stations, each holding his weapon in his hand. They lined up from the south side of the temple to the north side, and stood near the altar in the temple, surrounding the king. Jehoiada led out the king's son and placed on him the crown and the royal insignia. They proclaimed him king and poured olive oil on his head. They clapped their hands and cried out, "Long live the king!" When Athaliah heard the royal guard shout, she joined the crowd at the Lord's temple. Then she saw the king standing by the pillar, according to custom. The officers stood beside the king with their trumpets, and all the people of the land were celebrating and blowing trumpets. Athaliah tore her clothes and screamed, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoiada the priest ordered the officers of the units of hundreds who were in charge of the army, "Bring her outside the temple to the guards. Put the sword to anyone who follows her." The priest gave this order because he had decided she should not be executed in the Lord's temple. They seized her and took her into the precincts of the royal palace through the horses' entrance. There she was executed. Jehoiada then drew up a covenant between the Lord and the king and people, stipulating that they should be loyal to the Lord. All the people of the land went and demolished the temple of Baal. They smashed its altars and idols to bits. They killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altar. Jehoiada the priest then placed guards at the Lord's temple. He took the officers of the units of hundreds, the Carians, the royal bodyguard, and all the people of the land, and together they led the king down from the Lord's temple. They entered the royal palace through the gate of the royal bodyguard, and the king sat down on the royal throne. All the people of the land celebrated, for the city had rest now that they had killed Athaliah with the sword in the royal palace. Jehoash was 7 years old when he began to reign. In Jehu's 7th year, Jehoash became king. He reigned for 42 years in Jerusalem. His mother was Zibiah, who was from Beersheba. Throughout his lifetime, Jehoash did what the Lord approved, just as Jehoiada the priest taught him. But the high places were not eliminated. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense on the high places. Jehoash said to the priests, "I place at your disposal all the consecrated silver that has been brought to the Lord's temple, including the silver collected from the census tax. the silver received from those who have made vows, and all the silver that people have voluntarily contributed to the Lord's temple. The priests should receive the silver they need from the treasurers and repair any damage to the temple they discover. By the 23rd king of King Jehoash's reign, the priests had still not repaired the damage to the temple. So King Jehoash summoned Jehoiada, the priest, along with the other priests, and said to them, "Why have you not repaired the damage to the temple? Now take no more silver from your treasurers, unless you intend to use it to repair the damage." The priests agreed not to collect silver from the people and relieved themselves of personal responsibility for the temple repairs. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and drilled a hole in its lid. He placed it on the right side of the altar near the entrance of the Lord's temple. The priests who guarded the entrance would put into it all the silver brought to the Lord's temple. When they saw the chest was full of silver, the royal secretary and the high priest counted the silver that had been brought to the Lord's temple and bagged it up. They would then hand over the silver that had been weighed to the construction foremen assigned to the Lord's temple. They hired carpenters and builders to work on the Lord's temple, as well as masons and stone cutters. They bought wood and chiseled stone to repair the damage to the Lord's temple, and also paid for all the other expenses. The silver brought to the Lord's temple was not used for silver bowls, trimming shears, basins, trumpets, or any kind of gold or silver implements. It was handed over to the foremen, who used it to repair the Lord's temple. They did not audit the treasurers, who disbursed the funds to the foremen, for they were honest. The silver collected in conjunction with reparation offerings and sin offerings was not brought to the Lord's temple, it belonged to the priests. At that time, King Hazael of Syria attacked Gath and captured it. Hazael then decided to attack Jerusalem. King Jehoash of Judah collected all the sacred items that his ancestors, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah, kings of Judah, had consecrated, as well as his own sacred items and the gold that could be found in the treasuries of the Lord's temple and the royal palace. He sent it all to King Hazael of Syria, who then withdrew from Jerusalem. The rest of the events of Joash's reign, including all his accomplishments, are recorded in the scroll called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. His servants conspired against him and murdered Joash at Beth Millo on the road that goes down to Selah. His servants Jozabad, son of Shemaeth, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer, murdered him. He was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. His son Amaziah replaced him as king. So it's interesting at the start in 2 Kings 10:32. It says, "In those days the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel's territory. Hazael attacked their eastern border and conquered various lands." The covenant that God made with Israel was one that was for the land, essentially. If they obeyed God's covenantal requirements, then they would have the land, and it seems that they were not, and so you have in these days the territory diminishing. And so, like, previously, you had Jehu come in and kill both the king of Israel, who was, I can't remember, Jehoram, and the king of Judah at that time, who was named Ahaziah, who had come down to visit the king of Israel. And after this king Ahaziah of Judah is killed, Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, seizes the throne and then kills anyone who would have more of a claim to the throne than her. So, pretty bloody there from Athaliah, except Joash, Ahaziah's son, is spirited away to the Lord's temple by his nurse. Which, it's funny that you have such a public place and Athaliah never discovers it for the many years that the king is hiding out in the Lord's temple, which is telling to her spirituality. Yeah, for 6 years. And then 6 years later, they bring out the king and have the priest, the high priest at the time, stations a cohort of bodyguards around the priest, around the new king. And Athaliah catches word of it, and she comes and shouts treason, except she's the treasonous one because she murdered the whole royal line, except she missed one. So all of this is in accordance with the law there. But yeah, after she had murdered the whole royal line, she herself is killed. They then, I guess, Joash had several reforms, apparently, as well. Including destroying the temple of Baal in Judah. Jehu had supervised the destruction of the temple of Baal in Samaria, and here the temple of Baal in Jerusalem was destroyed, and appropriately destroyed by the people of the land. One reason the people resented this worship of Baal in Jerusalem so much was because Athaliah had directed that sacred objects from the temple of the Lord be put into the temple of Baal. For the sons of Athaliah, the wicked woman, had broken into the house of God, and had also presented all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord to the Baals, from 2 Chronicles 24:7. So, not great there. But then Joash's reign takes after that, Joash wants to repair the temple of the Lord, and so he tasks the priests essentially with repairing the temple. That is, they take in the money, and you guys can have the money, just make sure that the temple is getting repaired. But by the 23rd year of King Jehoash, the priests had not repaired the damage of the temple. So to me, this kind of talks that they perhaps were not well equipped to handle the logistical matters of rebuilding such a building. The work was going far too slowly. In what year Jehoash gave the orders for these repairs we cannot tell, but the account here plainly intimates that they had been long given, and that nothing was done, merely through the inactivity and negligence of the priests. King Joash got to the heart of the problem. The building project was plagued by poor administration and financial mismanagement. Through Jehoiada the priest, he implemented a system where the money would be set aside, saved, and then wisely spent for the repair and refurbishing of the temple. So they had set up this system essentially where they drilled a hole into a chest that was locked, and once it was full, they counted the money and gave it to the construction managers. So through good administration of the project, they were able to find men who could be trusted to use the money wisely and honestly. The project was previously stalled not because of lack of money, but because of poor money management. The point is made that the project succeeded without taking anything away from the priests. The temple was not repaired and refurbished at their expense. They still received money from the trespass offerings and from the sin offerings. yeah, so they got that done. And then you had King Hazael of Syria attacking Judah, and Jehoash taking all of the, rather than defending the himself and the his country as king via his army, he bribes the king of Syria by taking all of the sacred things in the temple um, and giving them to Hazael. Instead of trusting God, Jehoash traded prior blessing, the sacred treasures of the temple, to protect his capital and kingdom against the attacking Syrians. Yeah. He was in a difficult place, wounded with an attacking and successful army bearing down on Jerusalem. He found it hard to trust God in this difficult place because he had stopped trusting God in easier circumstances long before. A reminder for us to always trust God, despite our circumstances. Yeah, King Asa had done likewise by buying off some Syrian king, who I can't remember the name of, essentially to have him break his bond with Israel and instead fight against them. So, yeah, and then you have Joash dying as part of a conspiracy. Okay, carrying on. Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 21. After this, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to depart from Rome, Paul approached them, and because he worked at the same trade, he stayed with them and worked with them, for they were tent makers by trade. He addressed both Jews and Greeks in the synagogue every Sabbath, attempting to persuade them. Now when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul became wholly absorbed with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. When they opposed him and reviled him, he protested by shaking out his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am guiltless. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went to the house of a person named Titus Justus, a Gentile who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the president of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians who heard about it believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul by a vision in the night, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, because I am with you, and no one will assault you to harm you, because I have many people in this city." So he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Now while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews attacked Paul together and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God in a way contrary to the law." But just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of some crime or serious piece of villainy, I would have been justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it concerns points of disagreement about words and names and your own law, settle it yourselves. I will not be judge of these things." Then he had them forced away from the judgment seat. So they also seized Sosthenes, the president of the synagogue, and began to beat him in front of the judgment seat. Yet none of these things were of any concern to Gallio. Paul, after staying many more days in Corinth, said farewell to the brothers and sailed away to Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. He had his hair cut off at Centria, because he had made a vow. When they reached Ephesus, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila behind there, but he himself went into the synagogue and addressed the Jews. When they asked him to stay longer, he would not consent, but said farewell to them, and added, "I will come back to you again, if God wills." Then he set sail from Ephesus, and when he arrived at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church at Jerusalem, and then went down to Antioch. So Paul went to Corinth, from David Guzik here. In Paul's day, Corinth was already an ancient city. It was a commercial center with 2 harbors and had long been a rival to its northern neighbor, Athens. Corinth was a city with a remarkable reputation for loose living and especially sexual immorality. In classical Greek, to act like a Corinthian meant to practice fornication, and a Corinthian companion meant a prostitute. This sexual immorality was permitted under the widely popular worship of Aphrodite, also known as Venus, the goddess of fertility and sexuality. In 146 BC, Corinth rebelled against Rome and was brutally destroyed by Roman armies. It lay in ruins for a century until Julius Caesar rebuilt the city. It quickly reestablished its former position as a center for both trade and immorality of every sort. One ancient writer described Corinth as a town where none but the tough could survive. It is significant that it was from this city that Paul wrote his Roman letter, and when one reads his description of Gentile corruption in that Roman letter, one has almost certainly a mirror of what he found in Corinth. Interesting. Yeah, Paul was a tent maker by trade, and so were this Priscilla and Aquila. Paul's tent making was an important part of his ministry, though he recognized his right to be supported by those he ministered to. In 1 Corinthians 9, 7 through 14, he voluntarily supported himself in his missionary and preaching work so that no one could accuse him of seeking converts for the sake of enriching himself. In the modern missions movement, people call any work that a missionary does to support himself on the mission field tent making. So, you have the leader of the synagogue coming to Christ from Paul's teaching there, which is cool. And since he was a leader of the community, it seems that many followed in his footsteps. But again, you have troublemakers who rise up against Paul and his companions, and so they bring him before Gallio and are attempting to levy some charge against him, but Gallio is not having any of it. In approaching Gallio, the Jews of Corinth tried to stop Paul's preaching work in the entire province. If Gallio had accepted the Jewish charge and found Paul guilty of the alleged offense, provincial governors everywhere would have had a precedent, and Paul's ministry would have been severely restricted. As it was, Gallio's refusal to act in the matter was tantamount to the recognition of Christianity as a religio licita. Yeah. Before Paul could defend himself, Gallio did it for him. He correctly saw that the government has no role in attempting to decide religious matters, though government does have a legitimate role in matters of wrongdoing or wicked crimes. Yeah, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. Gallio looked the other way when angry Gentiles beat Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. Probably both the crowd and Gallio himself were more against the Jews than they were for Paul. It was his duty to let this good man alone, but it was not his duty to allow the Gentiles, on the other hand, to begin beating the Jews. Interesting. So, you have, I guess part of it is some anti-Jewish animosity being harbored by Gallio here and the crowd. So, carrying on, Psalm chapter 145, verses 1 through 21. I will extol you, my God, O King. I will praise your name continually. Every day I will praise you. I will praise your name continually. The Lord is great and certainly worthy of praise. No one can fathom his greatness. One generation will praise your deeds to another and tell about your mighty acts. I will focus on your honor and majestic splendor and your amazing deeds. They will proclaim the power of your awesome acts. I will declare your great deeds. They will talk about the fame of your great kindness and sing about your justice. The Lord is merciful and compassionate. He is patient and demonstrates great loyal love. The Lord is good to all, and has compassion on all he has made. All he has made will give thanks to the Lord. Your loyal followers will praise you. They will proclaim the splendor of your kingdom. They will tell about your power, so that mankind might acknowledge your mighty acts and the majestic splendor of your kingdom. Your kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The Lord supports all who fall, and lifts up all who are bent over. Everything looks to you in anticipation, and you provide them with food on a regular basis. You open your hand and fill every living thing with the food they desire. The Lord is just in all his actions, and exhibits love in all he does. The Lord is near all who cry out to him, and all who cry out to him sincerely. He satisfies the desire of his loyal followers. He hears their cry for help and delivers them. The Lord protects those who love him, but he destroys all the wicked. My mouth will praise the Lord. Let all who live praise his holy name forever. Amen. And finally, Proverbs 18, verse 1. One who has isolated himself seeks his own desires. He rejects all sound judgment. So Guzik here says, to cut oneself off from family, friends, and community is often to express a selfish desire. It shows an unwillingness to make the small and sometimes large sacrifices to get along with others. The Mishnah uses this passage to teach the necessity of not separating from the community because people have responsibilities as social beings. From Abbath 2:4. He rages against all wise judgment. God designed us after his own triune nature. He designed us to live in community. The instinct many have for isolation must not be overindulged. It is against all wise judgment. The protest of this proverb is against the self-satisfaction, which makes a man separate himself from the thoughts and opinions of others. Such a one finally rages against or quarrels with all sound wisdom. So, it sounds like part of that is regarding not listening to others or taking anything they say into account. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.